Okay, I think, am I audible in the back for those folks in the back? Okay, great. So that's working. Good evening. My name is Werner Steger, for those of you who don't know me, and I am a professor of history here at DCC, and currently the Greenspan Trust-Handel Foundation Endowed Chair in Holocaust and Genocide Studies. As always, it's a privilege to welcome all of you to tonight's event. This year represents the 20th anniversary of the establishment of the Greenspan Trust and Handel Family Foundation Endowed Chair in Holocaust and Genocide Studies. The Greenspan Trust and Handel Family Foundation have endowed this chair in 2006 to raise awareness about the genocides of the 20th century and the Holocaust in particular. I had the honor to hold the chair for most of those years, and it allowed me to invite literally a who's who of leading scholars in the field to speak in this venue. The Handel Family Foundation has supported the educational mission of Dutchess Community College with 2 endowments and numerous other ways over several decades now, which has been contributing immeasurably to a vibrant cultural and intellectual life, not just here at the college, but also in our community. It is their generosity that has made it possible to bring outstanding scholars like Dr. Dagmar Herzog to DCC tonight. Unfortunately, our good friend Shirley Handel had to send her regrets, and she can't be with us tonight. This evening, the Handel family is represented by her son, Stephen. Please join me in thanking and recognizing the Handel family for their generous contributions to enrich educational life here at DCC. So before I introduce tonight's speaker, I would like to extend a special welcome to Dr. Peter Jordan, president of Dutchess Community College, and thank him for his support of events like the one this evening. I also appreciate the support of the DCC Foundation Board of Directors for this event. Special welcome to Adam Podbora, the chair of the board, David Wise, vice chair of the board, and board members Joseph Kish, Michael Hall, and Laura Betros. Thank you very much for all the work you do for the foundation and the college. Last, but certainly not least, my appreciation goes to the DCC Foundation. Executive Director Anna Para and her staff have once again made sure that this is an impeccably organized event. Just as always, a quick plug for the DCC Foundation. An indispensable part of Dutchess Community College. The foundation does not only administer endowments such as this one, but provides hundreds of thousands of dollars in scholarships for students every year. If you participate in the annual foundation's golf tournament, you would get like a gigantic, handsome umbrella, which would have come in very handy today. I have one actually. Where's my umbrella? Ooh. It's in the Ritz. I have to make sure. Where's Anna? Like my umbrella is in the Ritz Lounge. Okay, it's a fancy one. I never went to the golf tournament. I just got one anyway. So, but it's a nice one. That's why I'm like worried. Okay. So, if you appreciate what you see tonight, don't be bashful. Contributions can be made through the foundation's website. And finally, a note regarding the logistics of the event. Dr. Herzog's lecture will be followed by a brief Q&A, as well as a book signing right outside the auditorium. Also at this time, I'd like to ask you either to silence or turn off your cell phones or other devices. So, it is my pleasure to introduce this evening's guest, another prolific and extraordinarily productive scholar and author. Dr. Dagmar Herzog is a distinguished professor of history and Daniel Rose faculty scholar at the Graduate Center of CUNY. She is the author of numerous books and essays on disability activism, sexuality, gender, Nazism, and the Holocaust. Her works include Sex After Fascism, published in 2005, Sexuality in Europe from 2011, and Cold War Freud from 2017. And most recently, The New Fascist Body, which was just published right now in 2025, right, Nick, last year. Dr. Herzog's 2024 book, The Question of Unworthy Life, Eugenics and Germany's 20th Century, has won several awards, including the Disability History Association's 2025 Outstanding Book Award, the Alan Sharlin Memorial Book Award from the Social Science History Association, and the Social Science Book Prize awarded by the German Studies Association and the DAAD, the German Academic Exchange Service. The Frankfurter Allgemeine Zeitung, this is, for those of you who don't speak German, probably the leading newspaper in Germany, sort of like the German version of the New York Times, only better. The Frankfurter Allgemeine Zeitung called that book one of the 8 best nonfiction books of 2024. In 2023, Dr. Herzog was awarded the Sigmund Freud Kulturpreis. So she comes to us highly decorated. Her work appears in both English and German, and sometimes, as with the Question of Unworthy Life, in German first. Now, over the years, Dr. Herzog also has been widely interviewed by media outlets in both Germany and the United States, running the gamut from the Bavarian State Broadcasting Service to The Daily Show with Jon Stewart. And I can tell you that the difference between the Bavarian Broadcasting Service to Jon Stewart is a chasm. It's like, very different. And lastly, I can't help myself, Dr. Herzog also appeared in a 2006 German documentary film titled "Do Communists Have Better Sex?" And the title is a bit of an awkward translation of the original. The film explored sex in a divided Germany during the Cold War. I did miss that film, but I believe the answer was yes, of sorts, right? Yeah. So I'm glad we have a last light moment here, because the actual topic of what she will talk about is fairly grim. Let me introduce the topic, right? In 1995, Henry Friedlander, a survivor of Auschwitz, and at the time a professor of Judaic studies at Brooklyn College, published a book called The Origins of Nazi Genocide, From Euthanasia to the Final Solution, which I think still stands the test of time as one of the standard works on the subject. Friedlander, as a Holocaust survivor, was adamant in including disabled victims when discussing the Holocaust, pointing out that people deemed disabled by the Nazis became the first victims of systematic killings, producing experts, personnel, and methods of killing later applied to European Jews. Indeed, the so-called euthanasia program became the first genocide perpetrated by Nazi Germany. Dr. Herzog re-examines this grim history by arguing that the theoretical groundwork of euthanasia was done long before the Nazis came to power, and that it cast a long shadow into post-war Germany. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Herzog to DCC.
Okay, hi, thank you all so much for being here for what I know is a downer topic. This is a story about how a society got tremendously morally disoriented, and usually the people in this series talk about the Holocaust of European Jewry, and I'm going to be talking about the other half of the story, which is the master race's self-hatred, and its turning against the disabled people within its own side. So the most immediate roots of the project lie in a plump footnote in a prior book where I explored the impact of the philosopher and animal rights activist Peter Singer, he's now a university professor at Princeton, advocacy for infanticide of disabled human newborns, something he was articulating especially loudly right around the end of the Cold War, 1989, on the just then developing impasses between abortion rights on the one hand and disability rights as human rights on the other. And because I was working on this problem of abortions on grounds of disability and reading about Peter Singer actually calling for infanticide, I had to teach myself the history of the lessons that were drawn from the persecution and murder of people with disabilities in Germany in the Nazi period. So I had to teach myself the lessons drawn from the Nazi eugenics, which included 400,000 coercive sterilizations, the majority on grounds of the supposed heritability of, see my quote marks, my fingers, feeble-mindedness, and 300,000 euthanasia killings. Okay, euthanasia is also a euphemism. These so-called mercy deaths were, of course, murders. And what's really important to understand is that people with sensory, like blindness or hearing impairedness, were also persecuted, and many of them, if it was shown to be heritable, were actually sterilized. But the vast majority were cognitively disabled or psychiatrically ill. They had a diagnosis of schizophrenia, which was a huge umbrella diagnosis for every kind of mental illness. And the vast majority of people who were sterilized actually had a learning disability. They were actually not so disabled. They were functioning perfectly fine, but they were considered feeble-minded. So it's just important to understand that we're talking about cognitive and psychiatric disabilities. So teaching myself for that long footnote turned into 5 years of research, working on the book. And the research process led me in totally unexpected directions. It led me to understand even more about the apparently chronic difficulty of recognizing and embracing the full and equal humanity of individuals with intellectual impairments, also profound impairments, and just how much ambivalence about accepting acute vulnerability as part of human life is constantly being inculcated in all of us. And it led me to understand more deeply that we cannot fully grasp the grotesque criminal energy at work in the Nazi Third Reich without confronting how it was rooted not solely in vicious anti-Semitism based on the most ludicrous lies about Jews, but also in aggressive repudiation of all the imperfection and vulnerability within the purported master race. So one of the ways we can recognize a fascism when we see one is how it likes to trample on weakness. So really, think Down syndrome, autism, cerebral palsy, ADHD, that's the kind of thing you need to think about. So when you think about the Holocaust, there's lots of ways to enter the story, but this is what we're going to try. 6 million Jews slaughtered. You undoubtedly think of concentration camps and ghettos, of death factories like Auschwitz, where 1 million Jews were murdered in gas chambers fed by Zyklon B, a pesticide, or of other death camps. Or, looking at the right-hand side of the screen, you think of the Holocaust by bullets, because another 2 million Jews in Poland, and especially in the Nazi-occupied territories of the Soviet Union, were murdered in mass shootings. Less familiar, or only vaguely registered, are these, as I said, 300,000. It's a tiny genocide compared to the big one, right? Killings of people carrying diagnoses of psychiatric illness or behavioral or intellectual deficit. They were killed initially in one of 6 carbon monoxide-fueled gas chambers on German or Austrian soil. So 70,000 human beings were killed in that way. Some were killed in mass shootings on the Eastern Front, so again, by bullets, or in a later, second decentralized phase of the euthanasia murders, with double the death rate of the first phase. They were killed by medication overdose, poisoning, or systematic starvation. Hitler would call a halt to the initial gas chamber phase of the so-called euthanasia in the wake of the Catholic bishop Clemens August von Galen's internationally resonant sermon of August of 1941, eloquently decrying the killings. But soon, 121 men who had gotten their training and their practice in mass murdering people with disabilities were transferred to Nazi-occupied Poland to assemble the death factories of Belzec, Sobibor, and Treblinka. So there, with great energy and ingenuity, these 120 men would accomplish a full quarter of that mega crime that we now call the Holocaust. 1.5 million human beings with carbon monoxide in gas chambers. So it was not least by reference to this key detail of a sequential connection and the overlap in personnel and in the specific gassing technology, carbon monoxide rather than Zyklon B, between the murders of individuals with disabilities and the murders of European Jews, that researchers and activists have succeeded in cohering the scholarly consensus that the euthanasia murders deserve recognition as Nazism's first genocide. Henry Friedlander, who Werner just mentioned, the late historian and Auschwitz survivor, at several occasions told the story, I was there when he did it often, of being accosted recurrently as he was researching the entanglements between the euthanasia killings and the Holocaust, and he was informed that his was a completely mistaken approach. How can you compare Jews with crazy people? One top-level official within an American Jewish organization had indignantly demanded. But also many, many others within Holocaust studies circles were unconvinced why they should care about what happened to, quote, the handicapped. This was so even though the very first installment of the megacrime we call the Holocaust was, in fact, a, quote, special action. Of course, the Germans always have these terms, Sonderaktion, targeting specifically those individuals who were both Jewish and disabled, Jews with cerebral palsy, epilepsy, autism, Down syndrome, or mental illness. Nor is it irrelevant that the United States in the 1930s had explicitly denied visas to individuals with intellectual or physical impairments, and thus also Jewish families fleeing the Third Reich were forced to leave disabled family members behind. Friedlander, you get to see him there. His own answer to the question had been posed to him, came in the form of the groundbreaking book, Origins of the Nazi Genocide. In the preface, Friedlander explained how he had come over the course of the 1980s and 90s to understand the murder of the disabled, not merely as a prologue to the Holocaust, but indeed as its first chapter. For Friedlander, moreover, the killing of people with disabilities would come to serve as the model for all Nazi killing operations. And his framing of the issues has been broadly persuasive. So the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum, in its own efforts to integrate the history of euthanasia more adequately into its presentation of the Holocaust, on a webpage now refers to the killing of people with disabilities as in itself a rehearsal for Nazi Germany's broader genocidal policies. But within Germany, this are a demonstration in 1980 in the city of Frankfurt, in the years around the end of the Cold War, highlighting the interrelationship between euthanasia and the Holocaust, no matter how asymmetrical their sizes, 300,000 versus 6 million. And even as the connections, you can see how she's got the wheelchair inside the yellow star, are sort of made more by intuitive analogy than by specifying literal links. It served a further crucial function, and that was the assistance that such references, such connections provided for advancing the so long rebuffed cause of disability rights. For as it happens, the more immediate post-World War II decades had seen a, really in hindsight, stunning, at that point just crushing, breadth of popular support for the perpetrators. People loved the perpetrators of the euthanasia murders, and ongoing shaming of the victims and their families. It took 40 years, 50 years, into the 1980s and 90s, to get not just the disability murders taken seriously as a mass crime, but also the coercive sterilizations to be formally acknowledged as an injustice at all. And the tens of thousands of often deeply traumatized survivors offered even the most insultingly meager amount of recognition and recompense. And, except for pockets of amazingness that I then made it my business to find and highlight in both the democratic West of Germany and the communist East, it took even longer to change popular attitudes and actual practices of care and education on an everyday basis. So unlearning eugenic thinking proved to be a very long post-fascist process. People with disabilities were not, quote, the forgotten victims, although they're often lumped together that way, together with Roma and homosexuals, but they're really aggressively repudiated. So to induce identification or even just empathy with the plight of people with disabilities, especially those with cognitive impairments or psychiatric diagnoses, though I have to say there was an astonishing amount of hostility to people with physical disabilities as well in the post-war period, turned out to be just extraordinarily challenging. So activist efforts like here in presenting the murders of people with disabilities as, quote, the trial run for the Judeocide, the rehearsal, the test, etc. It was the trial run is a phrase by a man named Ernst Clay, who's one of my book's heroes, was not just a summary finding based on a wealth of empirical evidence. It was really an ethically engaged, passionately pursued strategy for undehumanizing the disabled, for insisting that their suffering should matter, for trying to get people to give a damn. So when I first began the research for the book, I was in the archives of the Hadamar Memorial Center near Frankfurt. You can see the word Hadamar there. This is one of the 6 killing sites back in the day. Hadamar was one of the 6 T4 gas chamber killing sites, and those here are dream catchers that are made by school children who come every week in order to memorialize the victims. Inside this barn, there's the barn, where the buses brought the patients to be killed, and then they were brought down into the basement of the gas chamber. So this is where I was, because there's an archive there, and I had many questions. The scholarship on the 3 professions that saw the topic of intellectual disability as part of their remit. So who takes care of the disabled, right? It's religious charity, mostly Christians, a few Jews, but mostly Christians, psychiatric medicine, and remedial pedagogy, what we now call special ed, right? And there's a lot of scholarship on each of those, but no one had really looked at how they're interacting with each other, and how all through the 150 years that my book is about, how they argued over the value or lack of value of disabled lives. And so I became really interested in about 3 puzzles. One is the seductive power of the eugenic paradigm and the ferocity with which it was implemented despite the total flimsiness of its scientific premises. So eugenics is this idea of good birth, good breeding, and the belief that there's a pecking order of human worth, that the smarter people are somehow better, and that people who are lesser than that really don't deserve to be making babies. And it's actually based on totally flawed scientific premises, but it was obviously enormously appealing to many people. Secondly, I was interested in the long-term damage that Nazism did. Anti-Jewish feeling did not stop after Germany was defeated in 1945. Homophobia did not stop, and anti-disability hostility did not stop. All the propaganda that Nazis engaged in had lasting effects. Fascism takes hold of people's souls, their hearts and minds, and it's really hard to get over it. And then what I really wanted to understand is, what did it take then to actually change people's souls, their hearts and minds? I wanted to understand what it finally took to develop radically different perspectives on disability, also intellectual disability, not just in memory politics in terms of honoring the victims of euthanasia and sterilizations, but also in care practices and public attitudes for the living disabled. So now this is a book, just so you can see my 5 chapters. It's about the prehistory and the afterlife and aftermath of the Nazi first genocide, winding through 6 political regimes. So Imperial, Weimar, Nazi, West, East, and then reunited Germany since 1990. The euthanasia murders turn out to have been a program rooted both in totally cynical careerism, just opportunism, and phantasmatic delusions, this idea that we could actually create the master race and get rid of all imperfection. Basically, the perpetrators and their enablers pursued the fantasy of eradicating mental deficiency and turning the Germans into a folk that was beautiful, healthy, strong, and smart. But I also learned so much more about this tenacious, lingering hold of what one of my characters calls the fascism in the heads, and just how excruciatingly difficult that was to get over. It would take 100 years, from the 1870s, 1880s, when the Protestant and Catholic so-called idiot institutions, these residential centers for people with disabilities, first proliferated across the German landscape, to the 1970s, 1980s, when a new generation of radical young professionals and activists revolted against what they perceived as the morally abhorrent post-fascist settlement, before a really egalitarian and beautiful vision would be articulated and an experimental oases, both Communist East and Democratic West, be put into practice. So you have to imagine in the post-war period, things were horrifying within the institutions. They're just really devastating conditions. A revolutionary perspective shift was needed in order to treat human beings with disability as human beings. So those people are my heroes, and this will be ultimately a happy end story because they end up changing everything, but it took a long time. So just a bit on the structure of the book. If I want you to be able to imagine what these institutions were like. This is from 1870s, 1880s, 1890s. It's entire villages, entire counterworlds to modernity, where people with disabilities are being kept and working in the fields, in the kitchens, in the laundries, and so on. They were also, Germany was really precocious in starting remedial education, so there were ordinary schools for everybody, public schools, but there were also special ed schools already starting in Germany in the 1880s and 90s, hundreds of them. One of the takeaways that I learned from doing this research is the foundational point: what causes disability? At the time, poverty was the major reason. Yes, sometimes wealthy or middle-class people also have disabled children. Down syndrome is random, etc. But 85 to 90% of all cognitive disability was due either to malnutrition, especially of the mother during pregnancy, or diseases of toddlerhood. Imagine the fevers that babies get before there were any antibiotics. So those fevers that cause meningitis and encephalitis was one of the major causes. And of course, people who were in poorer circumstances were more vulnerable. Another thing I noticed from doing the research is a profound ambivalence towards their residents and their pupils that was already in the 1880s and 90s being expressed. Like, they're creating these supposedly loving villages, but in fact, they don't really love their people that they're taking care of. There's this feeling that the care and the education are sour and thankless tasks, and there's a fixation because, quote-unquote, idiocy is incurable on at least inducing usefulness, that was the word, in their charges. In other words, the capacity to do some kind of productive labor, if only tautologically labor to help maintain the institutions. So already by the 1890s, it's standard to create a hierarchy of the residents. There's the educable ones, there's the merely trainable, and then there's the so-called care cases. In German, it's called Pflegefälle. The people who are so vulnerable that they can't work, they require the labor of care from others. So this place, Bethel, like Bethel, House of God, it's the largest Protestant organization in all of Germany, still to this day. And these were actually totally cherished, totally loved. This is an unusual place. These photographs came together with stories about how much the patients were loved, and that was unusual. The vast majority of institutions, they treated these patients as like barely, they were like, people were basically diapered and fed, and that was it. There was no therapeutic engagement. Another thing that happened is that psychiatrists, medical professionals, had actually never cared about, quote, idiocy. They said, no, insanity is what we do. We do madness. We don't do cognitive disability. And suddenly in the 1890s, the Prussian state made a change in the financing. It became financially useful to have a career in one of these institutions. And so doctors flood in. They never cared before, and suddenly they're all there. And they invent new categories of reality, new diagnoses, like psychopathological inferiority, which any of us could get as a category. It's so subjective. It's just like anybody they don't like, they can label that. Or moral feeble-mindedness for working class girls who sleep around, or for working class boys who do petty thievery or whatever. So it really is a class dynamic where the doctors are doing a war against the poor and labeling them as people who are problematic and giving them a biological label even though it's a social thing. Okay, no less striking is that by the 1890s into 1900, I know there's a lot of quotes, we can talk about it later, is that it's becoming totally socially okay already to express death wishes, the wish that to kill these people against both disabled newborns and the long-term institutionalized. So around 1900, it's already becoming socially acceptable, and the charities are very much on the defensive. Not least, the dream of a disability-free nation was being erotically supercharged, especially by this guy, Alfred Plutz. That's him. So this is a book in 1895, and he's enormously popular. He's a doctor. And he has this idea that the German nation is going to be just absolutely fabulous if it can basically do infanticide on its disabled newborns. And he has an idea about the naked maidens and how they're all going to make perfect babies and they're all going to be smart. And this is actually later becomes Nazi policy. But he's the one who sort of articulates this dream. In addition, already by the 1910s, there was a reverse causation argument gaining ground. So instead of recognizing, which they all knew, that poverty causes disability because of malnutrition, because of toxins in the environment, and because of fevers, they suddenly say the poor are at fault for their own condition, and they start to argue that it's hereditarily transmitted. Feeble-mindedness only looks hereditary because poverty replicates across the generations, and they actually knew that, but they start to argue that it's biologically transmitted. And so this is where the groundwork is placed for what would become, over the course of the 10s and 20s then, the steep ascent of this eugenic paradigm that says, and so you can see at the very top, 1914, they're saying it's 1.5 or 2% of the populace. That's not very many that they think they need to sterilize. And by the time we get through to the 1920s and 30s, then they're suddenly saying, oh, maybe it's 20%, maybe it's 30%. Can you imagine 1 in every 3 of your fellow human beings you think doesn't deserve to make babies? That's a lot of revulsion in your own populace, right? There's this idea that 30% of fellow citizens are so subpar they should be prevented from procreating. And in the midst of all this, wham, what's different about Germany compared to, say, England or the United States, where they also have strong eugenics? Germany loses World War I. They don't take well to losing. And in 1920, after that defeat, they decide to blame the disabled. So you all know about the stab in the back myth, that it really wasn't the military generals who lost World War I on the battlefield, but rather the Jews and the Social Democrats on the home front. This is like a second stab in the back myth. It's all those unbearably disgusting disabled people who are weighing us down. And in 1920, Alfred Hoche, a psychiatrist, and Carl Binding, a lawyer, published a little bookie, it's like 60 pages, in which they propose how to kill the disabled, because they're such a burden. So this whole phrase, life unworthy of life, they invented it, right? This is die Freigabe der Vernichtung Lebens und Werten Lebens. Lebens und Werten Lebens, that's life unworthy of life. They are the coiners of that phrase. That dominates the terms of debate for another 80 years until people finally stop talking in that way. But you can see from the quote here that they really are mobilizing a disgust argument, an emotional argument, and they also mobilize an economic argument. We cannot afford to be supporting the disabled because they're dragging us down. So they're thinking of the disabled both as an economic and as a biological burden. Christians, Protestants and Catholics, but above all the Protestants, because they have the largest role within the charity organizations, are having trouble explaining why not kill. They're really on the defensive when this book comes out. And the difference is, although death wishes have been circulating, what's new about this book is that they actually have a plan. We're going to have 3 people going through all the institutions and choosing who needs to be killed, all the care cases that are basically a burden because they're not working, right? So it's a concrete thing, and the Christians in response are having trouble because they're defensive, and they end up coming up with a moral compromise formation, which is, we do not want to eliminate the victims of guilt and sin, and we don't want to kill them, but to attempt to prevent them. So murder, no, but sterilization, yes. So this is a huge move when the Protestant church decides that sterilization is going to be okay. It's just at the moment when it's even becoming imaginable and feasible to do large-scale amount of sterilization. But you can see that they're the victims of guilt and sin. That's basically acting like disability is caused by guilt and sin, which is a terrible thing. Protestant charity experts, for overdetermined reasons, have spent the entirety of the 1920s promoting what I've come to call a theo-biopolitics, where they theorized, again, it's a lot of text, just to prove that I'm not making it up. They actually said this. The presumptively rising numbers of cognitively disabled Germans are the result of so much sexual sin and adultery in Weimar, Germany's licentious culture, encouraged not least by the media Jews, die Pressejuden. So because Weimar is considered a wild and fun place, and Jews are prominent in not only in medicine, but also in the media, there's this idea that all that sexual sin is being encouraged by Jews, and that's why we have so many disabled people. They literally have a causal theory saying it's sexual sin causes disability. This is a pretty pathetic argument for why not kill. So while they had initially resisted eugenics because it's secular, it's a science, in Weimar they took up the scientifically shaky idea that feeble-mindedness is hereditarily transmitted in the hopes that it would help them reinforce their conservative sexual messaging. So one of the several upshots, in addition, of course, to exacerbating stigma of the very people in their care, is that once the Nazis come to power in 1933 and pass what is then a coercive sterilization law, the Protestant church enthusiastically participates in the mass sterilizations and even invents further religious justifications for them. So this is interesting. Outside Office in Hamburg is a Protestant charity organization. Those are like the deaconesses, like Protestant nuns that are providing care for the disabled girls, and you can see their swastikas there at a nice picnic, right? So the disability care organizations welcomed the Third Reich. That's what's hard to take in emotionally. And this is in Bavaria, Buchbach, and it's basically, it's like a workshop where disabled boys are weaving baskets, and there's a swastika being woven into the basket, right? So this mix of anti-Semitism, anti-disability stuff, and pro-Nazi stuff was something the Protestant church was very much a part of. The Catholics, of course, they don't believe in intervening in reproduction, so they're against the sterilizations, and the bishops expressly say that, but they ultimately, also the Catholics, let the sterilizations happen. This is actually a guy who's later killed, but he is first sterilized, and he processes that by drawing these pictures. I mean, he clearly experienced it as a castration, as a deep, profound violation of himself. And here you can sort of see how these hereditary clan charts are just trying to find any sort of irregularity within a family tree in order to justify the sterilization. So basically, both Protestants and Catholics, having let the sterilizations happen, are totally helpless at the point when the Nazi policy shifts to starting to murder the disabled. So there are earnest efforts. Nobody does more than the churches at protest and at protection. They try to change diagnoses. They try to send people home to their families and so on. But overall, you'll see these buses show up and pick up people and deport them, entire groups of disabled people, and they bring them to the 6 T4 gas chambers. And later, after that T4 gas chamber program is shut down, they kill people by injection or starvation. Okay. In my book, I actually save the gruesome details for a later chapter because it's really only with a time lag after the war that people come to recognize what had happened. Nobody acknowledges it immediately, but just so you can imagine what it was like. The thing here in the middle is Grafeneck. It's in Württemberg. It's near Stuttgart. That beautiful castle, the yellow castle you see up on the hill. It's the first actively functioning gassing institution. And the black and white picture of that shed is where the gassings took place in that case, in a shower room. That's where 10,654 people were murdered in that shed, basically, in this garage, generally immediately upon arrival. The staff was having a wonderful time, horseback riding, swimming, skiing, the men partying at the local club with their female assistants who typed the fake condolence letters, the men bragging drunkenly about the, quote, good fertilizer that the smoke from the cremated corpses was spreading over nearby fields. The final awful fact is that, quote, ability to work, right? The care cases, the ones who can't work, those are the ones that are targeted for killing. So ability to work is what kept moderately, in quotes, disabled people alive. And in the second phase, where people are being murdered by poison or starvation, when mass murder is at its height, there were sites at which the entire system of both care and killing depended entirely on the labor of the disabled. It's like kind of hallucinatory to try to imagine this. So Hadamar, where I began my research, which I showed you earlier near Frankfurt, throughout the second phase ran almost entirely on patient labor. Like all cooking, all laundry, shoe repair, ground screws, all this care also for the perpetrators, the cooking for them and so on. It was the patients who did all that. And it's the patients who dug the holes for the mass graves on the hill above the asylum, and sometimes it was patients who had to hold down resistant fellow patients by force for lethal injections. So there's unmistakable echoes here with the death factories of the Holocaust. Okay, that's it. Post-war. 1945, Germany loses again. So chapter 3 is about the politics of memory in the democratic West. There is enormous popular and media support for the perpetrators, for the killing doctors. and the victims and their families continued to be shamed. Most of the physicians, and the three I've got here, Matilda Weber, there's women perpetrators, the women doctors who did kill children, Werner Kattal and Walter Schmidt, these people were all part of the child euthanasia program. The victims are shamed and the killers get scot-free and have flourishing post-war careers. These are signatures of a petition trying to get her out of jail. She didn't stay for very long. She got out. This is a photograph many years later. She's an old woman in the town, still beloved. It's ridiculous. A major trial was planned against the senior organizers of Nazi euthanasia by this amazing man, Fritz Bauer. He was a Jewish re-emigre. He is the one who ran the Frankfurt-Auschwitz trial, 63 through 65. I love this quote. Every time I step out of my office, I enter enemy territory. He was like the conscience of the nation after the war. So these are images from the Auschwitz trial. And concurrently with that, in 63 to 65, he's preparing a trial against the euthanasia murders as well. And that trial collapses, even made the New York Times, in 1964 because one defendant fled to Argentina, and above all, two of them conveniently committed suicide successfully. So there's one guy, one prosecutor who's impressive, that's Fritz Bauer. There's one doctor, Gerhard Schmidt, who writes this amazing book, Selection in the Asylum, which I still think is the best book on the subject. One bravely incorruptible medical professional. It's finally published in 1965, around the time the trial is collapsing, because his medical colleagues had suppressed the manuscript for nearly 20 years because they did not want exposure of the extent of the medical profession's complicity in the Nazi crimes. So Schmidt brilliantly analyzes the patheticness and the arrogance cum anxiety that motivated the euthanasia killings. And he's really clear that anti-disability hostility needs to be understood as a form of racism. This is kind of hard for people to get their brains around, the idea that eugenics is racism as opposed to a different thing. Because he thinks that basically you need to understand the Nazis are motivated by both racial hatred against Jews and racial fear about the imperfection within the self. But Schmidt's book is ignored, and his colleagues snub him for years, even though he's remarkable. Meanwhile, it's also for a long time impossible to get recognition, to say nothing of reparations, for those who were coercively sterilized. So you have to sort of imagine there's a tiny overlap of maybe 10, max 15% between people who are sterilized and people who are murdered, but really they're two different subsets of people with disabilities. So those who are sterilized are people who are functioning fine. They have jobs, they have families, and so on. They could be making babies, right? They're living out in the world. They're the not so disabled, they're sterilized, whereas the people who are murdered are the ones who require the care of others. Does that make sense, right? So it's a more severe disability. So it's really hard also to get recognition for the sterilized because the reparations law that the World Jewish Congress and other lawyers managed to get Germany to sign only addresses those persecuted on grounds of race, religion, or political worldview. Right? This is the post-Nazi law in the 50s. Where do the disabled fit? Are they persecuted by race, religion, political worldview? It's hard to know. No, they were persecuted by racial hygiene, which is a little different, right? I mean, is eugenics a form of racism became a major legal and moral question. The repudiation of the sterilization survivors by ex-Nazi medical doctors was very personal and very ugly. So these guys, all of whom sat on the sterilization courts, one of them was also one of the euthanasia killing doctors, choosing who was going to get killed, this guy Fillinger. They're like, no, there's no relationship between euthanasia and Holocaust. Totally different, nothing to do with each other. Eugenics is nothing, it's a science, it's not racism. And it takes this woman, Gisela Bach, she's a historian, she just passed away this year, she's an incredibly prominent historian, who in the 1980s transformed the paradigm for how people thought about this with her documentation that Nazi racism all along came in two forms, which she calls it anthropological against Jews and Roma and blacks, and on the other hand, against those hygienic, so it's anthropological against Jews and hygienic against imperfection within the would-be dominant group, the would-be master race. And her intervention shifts the conversation also among politicians So that finally, eugenics is understood in the West as racism. And so finally, the sterilization survivors can count as, quote, racial persecutees. So it's semantics. It's word choices, but it's semantics with enormous, enormous consequences. And also in the 1980s, this is my hero, Ernst Clay, so K-L-E-E, but it's pronounced Clay. This is him, hippie guy, an independent journalist and a non-disabled disability rights activist, the kind of guy who takes municipal politicians and puts them in a wheelchair and so that they can experience what it's like to not have curb cutting and so on. He organized in 74, 75 hundreds of wheelchairs to shut down the city of Frankfurt at rush hour to make the point about the buses needing to have the ability to have wheelchairs come on, that kind of guy. He wrote a book, Euthanasia in the NS State. Those are all the clippings of how popular and how discussed it was, which finally manages to shift the public's emotional identification away from the perpetrators and towards the humanity of the victims. So he exposes the perpetrators, the killers, as just opportunist careerists and callous hard partiers who are carousing with their secretaries and taking tourist vacations in the same buses in which they otherwise transport victims. The book is brilliant, and he communicates viscerally, like no one had before, just how grotesque the crimes were. So finally, it's thanks to him that aversion is directed against the killers and not their victims. So that's a politics of memory chapter, right? And then chapters 4 and 5 are about actual practices for living disabled people. Counter practices, counter concepts, counter projects. And on both sides of the wall, I've mentioned this, and you can sort of see in these horrific images, the post-fascist decades are terrible. In the wider public, there's tremendous hostility, and ex-Nazis are hired back as wardens and caregivers. You can imagine sort of a disability care clinic in which is all Nazis running around as the press, right? That's what it's like. Conditions are worse than they were before 1933. In the Communist East, the Socialist Unity Party, SED, pretends to socialist humanism. They're very proud that they're more humanistic than supposedly than the West. And they claim officially to be anti-eugenics, but the East is a worker state, an Arbeiterstaat. They're very proud of that. So they actually hide the most severely disabled, the care cases, quote unquote, who are considered not only ineducable but undevelopable. In other words, the people who can't work. They hide them from public view, and they leave their care to the churches or to old age homes or psychiatric things. And the dismal conditions last longer. This is even 3 years after the fall of the Berlin Wall. The conditions are still horrific. So there's significant scandals, and it's, again, my hero, Ernst Clay, who exposes this, that it's still going on. But on both sides of the wall, there are also exceptional people. So in the East, a little bit earlier, backing up in time, you saw Fritz Bauer, Auschwitz trial guy, Jewish re-emigre. In the West, his counterpart in the East, also a Jewish re-emigre, Friedrich Karl Kahl, super cool guy, also writes a book about the T4 killings and tries through a TV show and other strategies to get people in the East to care about the murders. When he attended the Eichmann trial in Jerusalem, the agents of the West German state were so anxious about the evidence that he'd gathered and would expose about the criminal Nazi backgrounds of leading politicians that they stole materials from his Jerusalem hotel room. So he's really an important figure within the East. And also in the East, there are young rebels who decide we actually can treat people with disabilities like deeply decent. So one of the T4 centers on East German soil is Bernburg, and this guy holding up a book with a beard is the doctor who comes in 1975. He's going to take over the psychiatric clinic, just like Hadamar in the West remains a psychiatric clinic even though it had been a killing center into the post-war decades. So also in the East, that's true for Bernburg. He's horrified when he shows up in 1975 to realize that the place for work therapy is where the gas chamber used to be. Like there's not enough room anywhere. And he commits himself to turning Bernburg into a memorial center. He's incredibly impressive. And he, together with a historian, write a book which becomes sort of the East German countertext to that pamphlet of 1920 saying that the disabled should be killed, and it's the definitive thing, the responsibility of socialist society for its severely mentally disabled members. It's a beautiful text. So there definitely were courageous people in the East as well. And there were oases of love. So there are therapeutic centers where people just decided to be wonderful. And this is one of those places. And that book, you see the picture on the right. In English, it would be What Kind of Island and What Kind of Sea, has now been translated into English. You can download it from the internet. The photographs are beautiful. They're from late 1970s, early 1980s. And they just show a place of love that was possible. So even within the total material and political constraints of the East, it was a significant possible thing. There's another place in the East. These people, upper right there, Uta and Jürgen Trugisch, are two pediatricians who take over an institution, again in the 70s. 400 people, including some survivors of the euthanasia murders, are still living there. And they transform the place just with new therapies and with new concepts and treat them like human beings, just to make it clear that that's possible. But now let's go back to the West. So turning back to the immediate post-World War II period in the West, you have to imagine what it was like to give birth to a disabled child in a post-euthanasia nation, right? I mean, just imagine you suddenly had a kid with Down syndrome in 1946, or with cerebral palsy because there was loss of oxygen in the birth process. It can happen to anybody, right? But meanwhile, the stigma against disability remains unbelievably strong. So, of course, what happens in the West, because it's a democratic nation, is that there's a disability rights organization started by parents, and it's mostly middle-class professional parents who start this thing called Lebenshilfe, life assistance. And ironically, because it tells you something about how esteemed the Nazi perpetrators still are, that they have to work with ex-Nazi doctors in order to get support from the German government. In the wider public, there's not just indifference, but active hostility to the disabled, including violence in a scandalous case in a village in Bavaria. This is 24 years after the end of World War II, 1969. I think in the United States, think Summer of Love and Make Love Not War and so on. This is violence at the prospect of even just living in proximity to children with disabilities. The villagers were anxious that the, quote, moron children would drive away the tourists they were so easy to attract. And in this little village, the Catholic priest, sorry, this upsets me more than anything else, there he is with the nice glasses. He eggs on the villagers as they beat and kick the home manager until his kidneys bleed, and they call him a Jew pig, a Judensau. He's not Jewish. They send the planned residents up in flames. They celebrate with a barbecue their success in driving away the children, and then the deliberately arriving too late fire department soaks everything in too much water, floods the burning building. So you see this mix 24 years after the end of the war of anti-Semitism and anti-disability hostility. The story stayed in the media for a full 3 years. There was an extraordinary film made about the case. I mean, the violence of the villagers was exceptional, but the attitudes were not. Opinion surveys that were conducted in the late 60s by the psychologist Helmut von Bracken. He'd worked with Gordon Allport at Harvard, came back to Germany, and he did research on attitudes. He found close to 70% of those questioned taking the view that it, quote, would be good if a child with intellectual disability died young. And you can see here also how respondents still believe that it's the parent's fault, right? More generally, there remained into the late 60s great confusion about the causes of intellectual disability. It's only gradually that assumptions that it's hereditary, that it's the parent's biological fault, right, give way to an understanding that the vast majority diagnosed as learning challenged come from conditions of poverty and precarity, no surprise. Nonetheless, the mainstream of special ed teachers remains condescending towards their own pupils. So when in 1973, this heroic guy, there's the first official proposal to integrate children with disabilities into regular schools, mainstreaming. It's totally normal to us now, right? This is vehemently rejected as illusionism, uncritical illusionism, by the head of the special ed teachers. So this is 1973, and it's this rejection by special ed experts that triggers a wonderful insurgent rebellion. It took into the 1980s to flourish fully, but young people are like, we're not going to put up with this anymore. And it's a four-way combination of a new generation of loving parents who demand integration of their children into the regular schools and show that it's totally fine and it totally works. It's also a newly self-confident activist movement of people who are physically disabled. So imagine polio or car accident or muscular dystrophy. They're physically impaired. They call themselves proudly the cripple movement. There you go. Like there's a guy with polio, there's a woman again in the wheelchair, et cetera. They're cognitively fine, but they emotionally identify with the cognitively disabled people and fight on their behalf in solidarity. And there's young radicals in all the helping professions that work with the disabled. So there's psychologists, doctors, nurses, teachers, physical therapists, social workers, and scholars and journalists. All of them initiate a revolution in thinking about disability. They get the sterilizations and the murders recognized as crimes against human beings. They count as murder, right? And they show that the sterilizations were done for grounds of racism. They make that argument, and they get people to identify with the victims and be disgusted by the perpetrators. But above all, they change how care is practiced. They change how people with disabilities are treated in everyday life. So that meant campaigning for deinstitutionalization, so dismantling these old mega institutions that had 400 or 1,000 people, getting them into family-sized group homes, participating in the community, and it meant transforming psychiatric practice. And very movingly, for some of the radical professionals of that era, the commitment to do this transformation in how they interact every day with the disabled is sparked by direct encounters with a tiny handful of survivors. So of course, when we think about the Holocaust, we think about how many Jewish survivors have been testifying to us for decades now, explaining to us what it was like. There were so many fewer survivors of the euthanasia murders, but there's a tiny handful, and they are still in the post-war period in some of these institutions. And this little man, that's him as a child, and then you see him playing the harmonica with the tall guy beside him was a Catholic priest. And then you see him as an older man in those other pictures. The guy holding the baby at the end is a doctor who came to Hadamar, that's right, the place where I began my research. This is the hill above the institution. Those are the mass graves, the way the American occupiers, came and found what it looked like after the war. That little man had been one of the grave diggers. And he's still stuck in the psychiatric institution as a patient. And Catholic priests and the local mayor, they're renting him out to do garden work because he's so good at digging. And he sort of counts as like a mascot for the town. He's like the little harmonica man. Everybody, oh, Heinzia, there he is. It's unbelievable, really. And the young radicals, and the woman is also a doctor and becomes the wife of the guy holding the baby. The point is that they gain his trust. They make the story public. They spring him out of there, and that's why he ends up showing up at their wedding later. But the point is that they save this one man's life, but also they are transformed in their understanding of what happened because nobody had taken the trauma of the survivors seriously. So if we go, let me see. And special education was totally revamped, finally. For me, the two most impressive radicals are these two dissident special ed teachers who modeled in practice, and as professors at the University of Bremen taught their thousands of university students. One of them died during COVID, the guy with the Black Lives Matter thing. This one's still alive, he's in his 80s. It's wonderful. He taught them, you can refuse all hierarchization of human worth. There's no more pecking order. You can see also the most severely disabled persons as fully equal and be in reciprocal mutual relationship and honor their preferences. And you can teach in such a creative way to an integrated group that everyone is able to participate in community. So they both of them concretely rescued people that had been neglected for decades. Georg Feuser, he actually goes to psychiatric wards where cognitively disabled people were sort of just chained up, and he gets them all out and gets them into a dormitory, gets them into school, and does therapies with them. They showed it was totally possible. 1984 marked a really important turning point because two members of the cripple movement, one has cerebral palsy, one has muscular dystrophy, they exposed the scandalous fact that teenage girls were still being coercively sterilized without their consent or even knowledge, and that the old parent support organization that had been started after the war, and the medical doctors, and the Protestant charities, and the special ed teachers were all totally complicit. They were using a loophole in post-Nazi law. So this was a really impressive example of their ability to cross-identify. They're physically disabled, they're cognitively fine, but they identify with these girls, and they make a huge scandal out of it. It makes it, you can still watch the Panorama show on the internet. You can see the TV show that came out of it. So they got the law changed so that it's no longer possible to sterilize people before the age of 18. And their commitment to the cause was lasting. So what happened 3 years later, when the prominent news magazine Der Spiegel, it's like the Time or Newsweek of Germany, wrote an obnoxiously worded essay about the supposedly higher rate of Down syndrome babies born in the wake of the Chernobyl nuclear disaster, it was members of the Cripple movement, again, same folks, who had the audacity to protest. And 2 years later, 1989, when Peter Singer, Australian philosopher, now Princeton professor, was scheduled to speak in West Germany about his idea that infanticide of disabled newborns should be okay, that's when the Cripple movement really burst onto the national scene and got taken seriously and began to set the terms of debate on disability rights as human rights. That's a totally transformative moment in 1989. And the learning curve since then has been steep. So one measure of the enormity of the transformation that's been achieved just over the last 20, 30 years can be found in the self-evidence with which now in the 2020s, both secular and religious advocacy and support organizations working with and for people with disabilities came to take as their bedrock premise the ideals of individual self-determination and full social integration. Memory politics, too, have come a long way. The radicals finally forced a massive public reckoning, not just with the Nazi period, but also with the obscene conditions that lasted into the post-war. And a particularly key example, this is, it's a little late in the game, right? 2017, they're finally doing an I'm sorry about the post-war period, but they did it. At Sadov, which I showed you earlier, there was a picnic with the swastikas and so on in Hamburg. This thing, the church in this Protestant thing had this altar picture since 1938, because the pastor-director made the art. It also happens to be the year, 1938, that he sent away all his Jewish disabled residents and gave them up, let them be deported to the euthanasia killings, even though he knew the destination was death. His Jesus is very muscular, and one of the reasons this whole picture was always so offensive is that the three people with disabilities don't have a halo, like they're not sacred. The other people are. So it's always been annoying. And what finally happened is that the young radicals who came in the 80s now as older people, in 2021, 2022, they took this Nazi-era art, lifted it, 58 tons, lifted it off the back of the church, just ripped it all off, flipped it around and drove it into the ground with glass. So it's like along a memorial walk, and now there's finally, the church just has like a beautiful clear glass window in that spot. So of course it's symbolic. It's 2021, 2022, it's pretty recent that this Nazi-era sacred art, but it's symbolism, just like before saying that eugenics is racism is semantics, and yet the symbolism matters tremendously because it means taking the dignity of the disabled seriously. So, what can we make of this 150-year story that runs from the 1880s to our 2020s present? For a very long time into the post-war, people didn't realize that that second decentralized phase of the murders after Hitler had stopped the gas chamber part, that it had such a large number of victims. They really thought that Bishop von Galen had stopped the murders. So the very first post-war theories are trying to establish a contrast. How come Christian protest, popular protest against the euthanasia murders happened, but not protest against the Jews? Those were the questions that were being asked in the 1960s. By the 1980s, it had become clear to disability activists that they could get the public to take the disability murders more seriously if they could make the connection to the Holocaust. So that's when we learn about the sequence, right? Oh, it's the same technology of carbon monoxide, and it's the same damn 120 men that are moved to do a quarter of the Holocaust, and so they keep on then making the argument. To this day, when I encounter people in Germany, they're always like, you know it was the trial run for the Holocaust. Like they're constantly connecting it to the killing of Jews. It's true empirically, and it's an incredibly important strategy. But you shouldn't have to hook a small genocide to a big genocide in order to get people to care. People with disabilities should count as fully human all on their own. So there's a third way, which I find the most interesting, which is to think about the two crimes in complementarity. What I mean is the Nazis were motivated by both racial hatred against Jews and racial fear against the imperfections within themselves. We could call this Aryan self-hatred. As the wonderful historian Gisela Bach, who I introduced, she put it, the promised race, the master folk, was not a given. It was not the real existing German folk. Rather, the master race had yet to be produced. The Nazis were arrogant, and they were anxious. They had a fantasy of making the German folk healthy, strong, beautiful, and smart. But it was just a fantasy, not a fact. And that's the grounds on which they sterilized and killed the supposedly imperfect Germans. That should be the end of the story, the fact that things are much better now. But there's one last wrinkle. The far-right party, Alternative für Deutschland, okay, these are Nazi images in the middle, but that's the AfD, entered the Bundestag in 2017. And it's doing scarily well. Its politics are a kind of postmodern fascism. It's primarily racist against migrants, but a big part of its success involves its family values posturing, even as it simultaneously luxuriates in deliberate sexiness. So we have, look on the lower right, the cute tushes, and the girls going in their bikinis, and it's like, burqas, we prefer bikinis. There are huge echoes here with Nazism's very similar mix of racism and eroticism. Those are Nazi nudes. There's lots to talk about here, about this mix of racism and sexiness. But a further distinctive feature of the Alternative für Deutschland party is its anti-disability messaging. No other far-right party in the world is obsessed with disability the way the AfD is, redeploying the time-honored strategies of stirring emotions, above all disgust, and economic worries. We can't afford to provide for them. This was especially evident in a formal inquiry to the government in 2018 with regard to the totally fabricated issue of migrant Muslim families supposedly producing disproportionately more children with cognitive impairments because of the, again, fantasized prevalence of, quote, incestuous marriages between blood relatives among refugees. It took me a while to realize this, but of course this anti-Muslim claim was totally grafted onto an older anti-Jewish trope from the 1920s, where it was contended the Jews produced more cognitively disabled offspring than Gentiles because they supposedly have more incest marriages. It's ridiculous, but the point is that the AfD is drawing on these old tropes, and they're just adapting anti-Jewish stuff, although they're also anti-Jewish, to anti-Muslim. But the AfD's biggest animus, they harp on it constantly, is directed against inclusion of children with disabilities in mainstream schools. They are obsessed. There is no, every single party program is against inclusion of disabled children. So the very thing that had been the main demand of the radicals in the 1980s, which is to have disabled kids be in normal schools with other kids. So what deep-seated insecurities about the citizenry's intelligence might cause the very notion of children with and without disabilities spending time together to turn into apparently the single most objectionable aspect of the only so recently won rights for people with disabilities in Germany, question mark. As I said, one of the many ways we can recognize a fascism when we see one is how much it loves trampling on vulnerability and weakness and coming up with rationalizations for cruelty. So I also look forward to your insights. Thank you for your patience. This thing is
this working?
Funky.
So thank you, Dr. Herzog, and this was sort of a tour de force of 150 years. And so if anybody has questions, we have a few minutes to ask questions. Is there anybody? Oh.
Hello, thank you for that presentation. It was amazing. This year, I actually just learned about the T4 program, and then a little bit later, I learned about a movie called Crank that was distributed through America. And it was basically promoting the Nazi sterilization program.
Right.
Harry Laughlin was in it and all that.
Yeah.
My question was what role did America play? Because we really dived into Germany, but was America similar? Were we a little bit less radical, or were we kind of right in the same boat? as a Germans?
Yeah, it's a wonderful question. Thank you so much. So yes, the idea that cognitive disability is literally biologically inherited, they acted like it was Mendel's peas, like the purple and the white pea blossoms. Like if you mix, people might look normal and seem smart, but they might have a recessive gene for stupidity, and if they partner with each other, it might turn into one cognitively disabled child. I mean, they had the most nonsense ideas, and also Americans promoted those. And they actually, they were in constant conversation with each other, and then the sterilization laws started in the United States earlier, right? Indiana, California, and so on had those laws earlier. Similarly, it's interesting, I'm from the American South, I'm from North Carolina. It's the earliest eugenics impulses in the United States are directed against poor whites, not against blacks. It's so interesting because it's about the imperfection against the would-be superior dominant group. It's a similar dynamic. It's only much later that we have, of course, also Hispanics and African Americans being sterilized. The initial thing is this idea we want to be that perfect master race that we actually are not, right? So that's an intriguing similarity. There's a lot of support back and forth when the Nazis know they're in good company. There's Scandinavian laws for sterilization and so on. The difference about the German situation, as I said, is Germany's narcissistically wounded because they lost World War I. And they're scrambling for reasons to blame themselves, right? They're their own imperfect people. And so the fantasy that you might need to sterilize 20 or 30%, that never happened in the United States. That's a level of self-hatred that's just out of control. I think that what happens in the post-war period is that too many people thought that eugenic thought went away, but that's if you're defining it in terms of simplistic theories of transmission across the generations. Anti-disability hostility stays everywhere. And you know, I'm from the City University of New York, CUNY, and one of our campuses is actually based where Willowbrook was. And that Willowbrook, in 1972, when Geraldo Rivera brought his TV team in, there were children lying in their own feces, children tied to radiators. There were grotesque medical experiments being done. The United States was not better at all. So there were radicals here. There was a disability rights movement here that had to get out of their wheelchairs and crawl up the stairs, various places in DC, to insist that we needed to have various laws. All of this now in the United States, I'm sorry to put it this way, Donald Trump thinks that his own grandnephew should be killed, shouldn't be allowed to die. I mean, the anti-disability hostility, one of the ways you recognize a far-right politics is its hostility to weakness. So there are echoes, but of course it's Germany where the action happened because the Nazis took over. On that incredibly depressing note.
I just wanted to add sort of just a personal angle to this, because as you all know, I grew up in Germany, right? And the children, got into first grade in 1969. That was first grade, right? Mm-hmm. And the children were actually quite literally selected out of kindergarten to go to either my school or to the Sonderschule, which was the special school, right? And then in the mainstream schools, not me, but some of my classmates were terrorized by their parents, telling them that if they fail exams, they may be transferred to the special school, right? Which has nothing to do with cognitive, anything, right? But it was almost used as sort of as a parental paradigm. It was terrible. So
it's really intense. Though, Germany was precocious in developing special ed in the late 19th, early 20th century. They're really quite advanced, but they're very invested in the segregated system. The idea is proximity to disability is going to slow down the bright ones. And of course, we have versions of that in the United States. There's people like the AP classes and giftedness and so on. But this idea that contact, one of the AfD politicians literally said that to have a Down syndrome kid in a regular classroom would be like having someone with a contagious disease on a ward with other patients. I mean, this is ludicrous, right? Yeah.
Well, thank you so much.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. And then we have. If you're interested in the book, Dr. Herzog is happy to sign a book outside, right? And you can read much more about this. Right?
Yeah.
Okay. All right, thank you.
All right, thank you. Been bumping this the whole time.